Both of the images on the screen were shot with the same settings, the same camera, and the exact same lens. However, one of these was shot in RAW and the other was shot in JPEG. Now, before you go further in the video, I want you to comment down below which one you think is RAW and which one you think was shot in JPEG straight out of the camera. Both of these files are completely usable and deliverable. They were both processed in ON1 Photo Raw and rendered down into a JPEG so I can put them into this video. But the real question is, which format should you shoot in? Hey, welcome back to another video right here on Freewheel Photos. Today we're looking at RAW versus JPEG and the processing inside of your camera. Which one should you shoot in and which one is better? All right, so here we are looking at the pros and cons of RAW versus JPEG. I'm only going to go over a handful of these things, but you can pause the video here and take a look at the pros and cons, and this is not an exhaustive list. Starting with the RAW images on the left-hand side. A RAW image is an uncompressed version straight off of your camera sensor and into the memory card. This saves a lot of information. It has a high dynamic range, and you have the ability to change color spaces in post-production software such as ON1 Photo Raw and Lightroom. The downside to this is these are large files. It can take some time to back up these files. If you're shooting hundreds and thousands of these on any given day, it can take a long time to back up the images, so that could be a downside for you. And these also need to be edited in order to be shared, which means you're going to have to go into a RAW processor like ON1 Photo Raw or Adobe Lightroom in order to do your processing and then export them to JPEG. However, one thing that I didn't cover in the pros is you have the ability to adjust exposure after the fact. Recovering highlights or shadow detail, you're going to get a lot of flexibility out of a RAW image than you will out of a JPEG. So now let's move over to the JPEG side. The big thing here, and the only pro that I really get out of JPEGs is the file size. JPEGs save on file size. I can shoot thousands and thousands of JPEGs where I may only be able to shoot hundreds of RAW images on a 32 gigabyte memory card. I can shoot almost like 4,000 JPEGs at medium or small, and that may be good for what I'm trying to accomplish. So just keep in mind that JPEGs, the biggest pro is that they're small. The downside, however, is the camera makes a lot of decisions for you. They're going to bake in a curve. It's going to bake in your color profiles. It's going to bake everything in. You're not going to have much opportunity in post-production to change any of that stuff. So if you choose like a black and white camera profile inside of your camera and then you go photographing, guess what? You get a black and white image. There's no color. You can't change that in the back afterwards. Whereas on a RAW file, you can change that to a color image if you so choose. All right. And then the last thing that I'll mention is it has a limited range for recovery in the highlights and shadow detail. You get about a stop. This is not scientific, but what I found is on most JPEGs, even when I have really good exposure, I get about one stop of shadow recovery and about one stop of highlight recovery. What that means is if you shoot a really dark scene and you underexpose it, you can boost it up by one exposure value essentially, and you'll be able to see limited to no artifacting. I will mention that there's going to be more noise depending on your ISO, but that's a whole nother conversation. And then vice versa. If I'm shooting a really bright scene and I feel like I blew something out, I'm going to get about a stop of highlight recovery before I start to introduce banding and artifacting into the image. And you know that you have introduced banding or artifacting when you start to see the individual pixels really like turn blocky or blurred, and it just doesn't look natural. This happens mostly around edges. So if you have a high contrast between maybe the sun and a tree, where the leaves of the tree would intersect with the background of the sun, that's where you're going to start seeing the artifacting. So something to keep in mind. Hopefully this was helpful. Let's continue on with the video. Let's move over to our images again. Now that you have seen a few of these pros and cons, maybe you can determine which image is the raw image and which image is the JPEG. All right. Now in 3, 2, 1, here comes the answer. So let's jump into ON1 and let me show you some of the edits that I went through. All right. So here we are inside of ON1, and as you can see, I have the images pulled up. On the left, this is the raw image, and on the right, this is the JPEG image. So let's go into the JPEG and look at the decisions that I had to make to, edit the image the way that I would like it to look. Because showing you the image straight out of camera really isn't going to apply, because a JPEG, in my opinion, is going to look better straight out of camera. But when you go and you make some, creative decisions, which on this JPEG you're going to see, I made very few creative decisions. And I didn't add any effects to either one of the images. I only messed with the develop settings. Okay. And with that, I moved the blacks down. I added some structure, and I threw in some vibrance. So here's what it looks like before I made any of the edits. This is the JPEG straight out of the camera. This is what it looks like. And without having a comparison side by side with the RAW, it looks like a great image. Let's go take a look at the RAW photo. So now we're inside of the RAW photo, and as you can see, I made a lot more edits here. Now, I'd like to pause for a second and say, if you are going to be editing RAW photos, you have to get used to making more adjustments. Now, you can easily go in and hit AI Auto or AI Match, and it's going to make a lot of decisions for you. But I think if you want to find out how your camera responds as a JPEG versus a RAW, is you photograph a JPEG and you edit the RAW to get as close to a deliverable JPEG that the camera would produce. This is going to let you know how much data your camera is really getting rid of and what type of work you need to really develop your images. All right. So what I learned here is, one, the JPEG, or the RAW, I should say, it lacked in contrast. It needed contrast, so I boosted that. It also retained, it was a more flat image, and it was, let me see if the histogram updates if I turn the preview off. No, it doesn't. When I opened this image up, the blacks were, like, there was no information spread into the blacks, which is why I moved the blacks down by -40. All right. It's going to be different for every image. I'm just showing you that on the Canon EOS R6, for whatever reason, and not a bad thing, just the way that the algorithm works, it does not render pure blacks when you have a what's considered even exposure. I shot these using aperture priority, and my exposure value was set to 0. So I was shooting what the camera thought was the evenly lit exposure for the brightest part of the image, which seems to be on this branch here and on these little buds. All right. That's, again, more technical than it needs to be. Moral of the story, I had to throw in some structure. I don't believe I threw in this much structure on the JPEG, which I found interesting. And then I had to mess around with the white balance. In the twigs here, they were a little bit more orange. Like, overall, if you look at it, the file is just way more warm than I would prefer it to be. This is all preference. Set your white balance accordingly. Obviously, you can go overboard or whatever. And then Again, I just messed with the vibrance here, and I have a -1 in the magenta, moving it more towards the green, and that's just because there's greens in here and it was too warm, so I wanted to kind of cool it down and match this tone here. And then I threw in vibrance. That's it. Going back to the two photos, they look almost identical. All right, so now that we have seen a few examples of a JPEG versus a RAW, let's talk about the question that most of you have probably clicked on this video for. Which one should you shoot in? My recommendation to you is, if you are brand new to photography and you're just now starting out, photograph in JPEG. Now, if your camera allows it and you have the storage, I recommend you photograph in JPEG and RAW. The reason being is, if you can save the raw data and you photograph something in JPEG, you'll be able to edit the JPEG, and when you get to the threshold of as far as you can possibly push that JPEG, you know that you have the raw image that you can fall back to, and you're going to have a lot more room to really work on. Now, the reason why I say beginners should start in JPEG is a raw file can be intimidating, and it can also cripple your ability to learn how to master your camera and get good exposure. When you are shooting in a or in a compressed format like JPEG, straight out of camera, and you realize that you're going to hit a ceiling at some point, you start to really figure out the limitations of your gear. I just want you to know that getting good exposure in camera is always going to give you a better post-production capability. Now, there are some situations where getting good exposure in camera is just extremely hard, and you may have 2 seconds to get the shot. And having that raw file in your back pocket is just going to give you a little bit more security and comfort. Then do it. All right. It's 100% up to you which one you want to shoot in, but don't discredit using JPEGs straight out of the camera, because those files are extremely good and they can be used. Now, if you're working on something where you have to have all of the detail that's available in an image, and you want to pull as much as you can out from the shadows and recover your highlights, you're absolutely going to want to shoot in RAW. Also, if you're photographing something that color accuracy really matters, you're going to want to shoot in RAW, because you need the capability of being able to edit your photo the way that you need to in post-production. ON1 Photo Raw does handle JPEGs and RAW files just a little bit different. Some of the things that you'll see different inside of a RAW file versus a JPEG is raw images will allow you to change your color profile. It'll allow you to change your camera profile, which those are two different things. It's also going to have the AI match feature, which is the JPEG that was embedded into your raw file when you snap the photo. And it's also going to allow you to change your white balance without adding artifacts or fringe or any sort of noise to your image. If you find yourself doing a lot of composites inside of ON1 Photo Raw, I highly recommend you work in JPEG. JPEG is going to render and process a lot easier inside of ON1 Photo Raw when you start to stack different layers. All right, that is something to take into consideration, because that's a big deal. It may not work for you if you shoot in RAW only and you're stacking 17 different layers. And this can also deal with how well your computer handles all of this. I have a GPU built into my computer, so I get a little bit of assistance there. But maybe your computer doesn't have a GPU, or maybe your GPU just isn't very good. All right. My recommendation, if you're doing composites inside of ON1 Photo Raw, do them with JPEGs. Even if you do have to shoot them in RAW, my recommendation is edit them, render them as JPEGs, and then start to build your composites. Hopefully this video was helpful, and if it was, I just need you to hit that like button, hit the thumbs up, give your boy some love. And in the comment section below, leave comments if you shoot RAW or if you shoot JPEG or what your thoughts are. You know, I would be interested just to hear who shoots primarily RAW and who shoots primarily JPEG. So drop that in the comment section below and, you know, let's just see. All right. And then last but not least, if you're new, consider hitting the subscribe button. Here at Free Will Photos, I generate ON1 tutorials and tutorials just like this to help you, a photographer, learn how to use photo editing software to get your creative vision out and into the world. If that's something you're interested in, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you get notified when I drop new videos just like this. So until next time, I want you guys to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.